All right, let's talk about something that haunts even the darkest corners of the Warhammer 40k universe. Not demons, not Xenos horrors, not even the ruinous powers themselves, but the idea of the Immortal Coil. A concept that feels less like a piece of lore and more like a curse whispered through the screaming folds of the warp. It's not a tangible prison. It's not chains or steel walls. It's something far more terrifying. An endless cycle of death and rebirth, suffering and awakening, in a place where reality and logic dissolve into madness. You see, in the grim darkness of the far future, death isn't always the end. Sometimes, it's just the beginning of something far worse. We've all read about characters being consumed by the warp, or losing themselves to it. But what if, just what if, they're not dead? What if their consciousness lingers? What if their soul gets caught in a current so strong and so cursed that it traps them forever in a cycle of torment, unable to truly die, unable to truly return? The term Immortal Coil evokes that image, a looped thread, a spiral that winds tighter with every passing death. And in the warp, where time is broken and cause and effect laugh at our understanding, such a coil could, in theory, exist. Some fans argue that this is the final fate for certain powerful psychers, corrupted heroes, or even entire ships that vanish without a trace. They don't simply disappear, they get caught in a loop where every ending leads right back to another beginning, each iteration more grotesque, more painful, more warped. Why does this disturb us so much? Because in a universe already defined by hopelessness, this is a special kind of hell. This isn't oblivion. It's the opposite. It's too much existence, stuck in a place that feeds on suffering, looping endlessly, possibly aware of it all. The warp doesn't just reflect emotion, it amplifies it. Now imagine your soul stuck in a place that echoes your agony back at you across eternities. The idea isn't even far-fetched when you consider how many psychers scream before they die, or how demons seem to never truly vanish. This universe is filled with lost ones, half-whispered fates, and characters that just stop being mentioned. Maybe they didn't die. Maybe they're still out there screaming, reliving the same nightmare again and again. And we'll never hear from them again. Not because they're gone, but because they've become part of the coil. So yeah, when we ask the question, are there beings trapped in constant warp rebirth? We're not just poking around for trivia. We're peering into a potential truth that even the Black Library dares only to hint at. A truth more terrifying than chaos itself. A fate where even death doesn't grant escape. If you really want to understand how something like the Immortal Coil could even exist, you first have to wrap your head around what the warp actually is. And that's not easy, because the warp isn't just another dimension, like some alternate plane or mirror world. It's not even a place in the way we normally understand space and time. The warp is emotion given form, it's thought bleeding into reality. It's a realm where rage, despair, desire, and madness churn together in a storm that's been boiling since the first sentient being felt fear. The thing that makes the warp so terrifying and so perfect for something like eternal rebirth is that time there doesn't behave the way it does in the material universe. There's no forward or backward, because doesn't always lead to effect. Sometimes you can walk into the warp and meet a version of yourself who hasn't even died yet. Or worse, a version who remembers dying over and over again. There are stories of ships that enter the warp for a few minutes and exit centuries later, or vice versa. People lost inside, aging a lifetime in what felt like seconds, or reliving the same moment endlessly, like a skipping record. And that's what opens the door to the idea of constant rebirth. Because if time is broken, then death, traditionally the end of the timeline, can't mean what we think it does. Imagine dying in the warp, your soul torn from your body, only to reappear at the beginning of your journey. Or worse, to find yourself hurled into some moment in your past, forced to make the same choices, watch the same people die, or fail all over again. Fans often speculate that this is what happens to certain psychers who disappear during rituals, or to those poor souls aboard black ships who scream themselves hoarse long after they should have been consumed. Another aspect is how the warp deals with identity. In the materium, your body anchors yourself. You have a defined shape, a brain that holds your mind, limits to what you can become. But in the warp, identity is fluid. Your fears, desires, guilt, they shape your form. That means even your soul isn't stable. So imagine what happens when a soul dies inside the warp. It doesn't just dissolve. It mutates, it fractures, and sometimes it reforms, not necessarily as what it once was, but still carrying echoes of who it used to be. That's not reincarnation in the classic sense. That's a recursive nightmare, like being torn apart and put back together, only worse each time. There are ancient texts, apocryphal ones mostly, that hint at this. Writings that describe damned souls wandering the warp for eons, screaming about the same moment of betrayal, or calling out to names that no longer exist. Some chaos cults even embrace this cycle. They believe that to die in service to the warp is to be reborn stronger, closer to their gods. But what if that rebirth isn't a blessing? What if it's a trap? A soul caught in a feedback loop, remade endlessly, each time a little less human. What makes this all feel even more plausible is how demons function. Demons don't die in the traditional sense. When they're slain in real space, their essence returns to the warp, and after a time they can manifest again. It's not that different from what we're talking about here, except demons want to return. They thrive in that cycle. Now apply that same mechanic to a mortal soul that doesn't want it. One that tries to die, but can't. That's where it gets horrifying. Some fans have speculated that the warp, being a realm of emotion, might cling to certain souls. That if someone dies in a moment of extreme feeling, rage, grief, despair, the warp might not let them go. It might replay that moment, or absorb their essence and recreate it again and again, like a song stuck on loop. And because time doesn't mean anything there, the soul might experience that loop infinitely, subjectively, endlessly. And let's not forget the influence of the Chaos Gods. These entities aren't bound by time. Their power stems from emotional resonance, and they feed on repetition. What better power source than a soul that dies in agony, is reborn in confusion, suffers again, and repeats? A perfect, endless scream echoing across the immaterium. If the warp had a hunger, this would be its favorite meal. That's what makes this idea more than just a grim bedtime story. The warp wants this to happen. It has the conditions to make it happen. And in a universe so utterly lacking in mercy, why wouldn't it happen? The Immortal Coil isn't some random myth. It's a logical horror born from the very fabric of the universe. It's what happens when you put souls into a place that doesn't obey rules, where emotion is stronger than physics, and time is just another victim. If you believe in the warp, then the Immortal Coil is not just possible, it might already be full. The soul in Warhammer 40K is not just some poetic concept. It's real, tangible in a horrifying way. It has weight in the immaterium, it leaves a trail, it bleeds emotion into the warp. And depending on what species you are, that soul might shine like a flare or flicker like a dying candle. But the thing is, every soul leaves something behind. Not all of them get to disappear. Some linger, some are held. And that's where the idea of being trapped in the Immortal Coil starts to really take shape. Let's start with humanity. The average human soul is relatively weak compared to the galaxy's psychic powerhouses, but it still feeds the warp. When a human dies, their soul doesn't just drift off into nothingness. If they're lucky, maybe the Emperor catches them, maybe the soul gets funneled into the Golden Throne or finds some other obscure salvation. But most of the time, it gets devoured. Or worse, caught in the churning currents of the warp, where it can be twisted, replicated, or recycled. There's a theory that particularly strong emotions at the time of death, terror, guilt, obsession, can anchor a soul, making it loop back instead of breaking free. And psychers? Their souls burn brighter, too bright sometimes. They're beacons in the warp. That makes them not just visible, but desirable to predators. Demons, gods, echoes, they all flock to that psychic scent. If a psyker dies in fear, alone, consumed by regret, their soul might become warped and reshaped, even without a chaos god getting directly involved. Rebirth for them might not mean reincarnation. It might mean being replayed endlessly, each time more distorted, until they no longer resemble who they were. Now Eldar are on another level entirely. Their souls are so luminous, so potent, that if left unprotected, they go straight into the jaws of Slaanesh. That's why they created the Spirit Stones, to catch the soul before it's eaten, to give it rest in the Infinity Circuit. But even then, there's no real peace. The Eldar themselves say that within the circuit, the souls don't sleep. They remember. They wait. And some even speak of the risk of those souls being drawn back out, put into new bodies, or worse, corrupted by lingering trauma. There are legends about Eldar souls whispering through the craft worlds, looping through the same regrets and failures for millennia. If that's not a version of the Immortal Coil, I don't know what is. The orcs are something else. Their souls, if we can call them that, are tied deeply to their Gestalt psychic field. When an orc dies, he doesn't go off as an individual spirit. Instead, his essence rejoins the big psychic mass of Wah, energy that fuels the whole species. That might seem like freedom from the coil, but think about it. What if a particularly bloodthirsty or obsessed orc gets remembered in that psychic soup? Couldn't his traits manifest again and again in other orcs, like echoes that never fully fade? Maybe it's not rebirth, but it is persistence. And then there's the Aldari's twisted cousins, the Drukari. They don't use soul stones. They feed on the suffering of others to keep their own souls intact. Their entire culture is based on avoiding being claimed by Slaanesh. Some fans speculate that those Drukari who die without feeding enough simply don't pass on. They get caught between realms, their hunger unfulfilled, their essence forever gnawed at by the Prince of Pleasure. Imagine being in that state, forever trying to escape, forever failing, forever feeling. The Necrons are a strange case. They don't really have souls anymore, at least not in the traditional sense. Their consciousness was transferred into metal bodies during the biotransference, and their spiritual component was mostly stripped away. But there are whispers in the lore about echoes of who they once were. Some cryptechs even attempt to reconstruct or recover fragments of the soul. If even machines mourn the loss of a soul, does that mean something still lingers in the immaterium? Could the remnants of these butchered spirits be trapped somewhere, unable to reform but still suffering in fragments? And the worst part? We don't really know who's safe. Even loyal servants of the Imperium, saints, martyrs, heroes, don't have a guaranteed afterlife. Some believe the Emperor protects them, but others argue that only the most exceptional get spared. The rest might just get devoured or fall into the coil without even realizing it. Not because they sinned, but because the warp doesn't care about intentions. It cares about impressions, emotional resonance, pain. That's the real kicker. The warp doesn't differentiate between good or evil. It doesn't punish, it echoes, which means anyone, even the most innocent soul, could get caught in its pull. Anyone could become a looping fragment, stuck reliving their death or their darkest moment forever. The more I think about it, the more I realize how terrifyingly plausible this is. Not just as lore, but as a mechanic of the universe. So when we ask what can be reborn, the answer is everything. Every race, every soul, even broken pieces of identity that shouldn't exist anymore. Because the warp doesn't forget, it remembers too much. And sometimes, it makes you remember too. Again, and again, and again. When we talk about beings trapped in an endless cycle of death and rebirth in the warp, the Eldar are the first ones that come to mind, and for good reason. No other race in the galaxy has such a cursed, tragic relationship with the immaterium. Their entire existence is defined by a mistake so massive, so catastrophic, that it literally gave birth to a chaos god. And the price they've been paying ever since isn't just cultural ruin or galactic irrelevance. It's a spiritual extinction on a scale we can barely comprehend. The fall of the Eldar wasn't just the collapse of an empire. It was a spiritual implosion. All that excess, all that indulgence, all that psychic energy, they poured it into the warp without realizing what they were building. And then came Slaanesh, not as a god of subtlety, but as an apocalypse. In one instant, billions of Eldar souls were torn from their bodies, devoured like a feast by a newborn god of pleasure and pain. Their homeworlds became the Eye of Terror. Their legacy? A shattered people whose souls were now eternally hunted. That's why the Soul Stones, or Spirit Stones, were created. These little gems are more than just cultural artifacts. They're lifelines. Every Eldar wears one, and when they die, their soul is pulled into the stone before Slaanesh can consume it. Then, it's usually placed into the infinity circuit of a craft world, where the soul can merge with the greater gestalt of ancestors, wisdom, and memory. It sounds peaceful in theory, like a spiritual retirement. But the more you dig into it, the more eerie it becomes. Because these souls don't rest. They linger. They observe. They sometimes speak to the living, advise them, or even possess them through wraith constructs. And that's where things get really unsettling. Imagine dying, and instead of finding peace, you're uploaded into an eternal network, fully conscious, still bound by duty. And when the craft world is in danger, you're pulled back into the fight, forced into a wraith guard or wraith lord body, unable to speak, only able to kill. Again and again. Death was just the end of one chapter, but the book keeps being reopened. Some fans argue that the Infinity Circuit is just a sophisticated prison. A beautiful, sacred one, sure, but still a prison. The Eldar soul doesn't get to move on. It's locked away. Safe from Slaanesh, yes, but at the cost of true rest. And then there are the cases where the soul stones get lost or damaged. That's the worst-case scenario, when a stone is shattered or taken by an enemy. Those souls either get consumed or just disappear, their fate unknown. Some say they wander the warp, screaming. Some say they're drawn into psychic eddies, living the moment of their death over and over. Some even whisper that Slaanesh doesn't always eat the soul immediately, that the god plays with them first, bending their memories, breaking them down, reshaping them into echoes of themselves. And if that's not the Immortal Coil in its purest form, what is? And we haven't even touched on the Inari yet. The followers of Inead, the death god the Eldar hope to awaken as their final weapon against Slaanesh. These people play with death. They believe in controlled death, orchestrated demise, spiritual unshackling. But there's evidence that their methods aren't perfect. There are reports of Inari being resurrected more than once, coming back changed, emotionally, mentally, even psychically. Each death leaves a mark. Each rebirth takes something away. Could they be spiraling toward the very thing they're trying to escape? Maybe the Inari path is just a prettier version of the coil, a spiral in gold instead of rust. There's also a growing theory that the more often an Eldar soul is bound to a wraith construct, the harder it is to pull them out of it. The line between living memory and cursed echo blurs. Some wraith constructs refuse to power down. Some fight even when there's no battle. Some have been observed whispering, no screaming, in languages no longer spoken. Are these signs of torment, of spiritual fragmentation? Or are these just the raw edges of a soul that has seen too much, died too many times, and no longer knows what peace looks like? The tragedy is that the Eldar know. They're aware of this. They fear it. They've spent millennia engineering ways to cheat Slaanesh, but none of those methods offer freedom. Only delay. Only containment. Whether in a stone, in a circuit, or in a wraithbone shell, their souls are always somewhere. Watching, waiting, remembering. That's why the Immortal Coil resonates so deeply with the Eldar narrative, because they're already living it. They're the blueprint. A people whose death doesn't mean release. whose greatest mercy is to be absorbed into a network that only mimics peace. And in the end, even that's not guaranteed. Because all it takes is one mistake, one lost battle, one cracked soul stone, and that soul might find itself cast into the warp, back at the mercy of the thing they've been running from for over 10,000 years. So if the Immortal Coil exists, you don't need to look far to find it. Just look at the Eldar. They don't need to believe in it. They are it. There's a certain moment when you're reading about demons in Warhammer 40K that something just clicks, and not in a good way. You realize that they don't die. Not really. You can kill them 100 times, scatter their form with bolter fire, vaporize them with sanctified plasma, banish them with holy rites, and still they come back. Maybe not immediately, maybe not in the same place, but sooner or later they reappear, grinning the same horrible grin. So you start wondering, are demons the original example of rebirth? Are they the blueprint for the Immortal Coil? Well, yes and no. It depends on how you define rebirth, and it depends on how you define being. Demons aren't like mortals. They don't have a physical form in the traditional sense. What we see when a demon manifests in real space is more like a projection, an emotional sculpture made of warp matter. It's shaped by the will of their patron god, by the strength of belief, and by the flavor of whatever horror they're meant to embody. When they're killed in real space, their body is destroyed, but their essence, the real core of what they are, snaps back into the warp like a rubber band. It doesn't die, it just resets. This is where it gets tricky. Is that rebirth? If something is destroyed, then reappears, is it the same thing reborn? Or is it just a perfect copy of the original? With demons, the answer is slippery. Some fans believe they retain memories, that when they return, they remember the pain, the defeat, the last face that banished them. Others argue that they're like programs rebooting. Same function, same personality, but not a linear consciousness. Just a set of parameters restored to factory settings. I lean toward the former. There are just too many references in lore, subtle ones, mind you, where a demon calls out a character by name, references past encounters, or expresses specific grudges. That kind of behavior implies continuity, which in turn suggests that they are caught in a loop of sorts. A loop where every death is just a rewind, every defeat a pause before the next playthrough. Sounds a lot like the Immortal Coil, doesn't it? But here's where it diverges. Demons don't suffer this cycle. They thrive in it. Unlike mortal souls who dread rebirth because of trauma or identity loss, demons embrace it. Their essence wants to return. It's hard-coded into them. In fact, their return is often celebrated by their own kind, marked as a sign of favor from their god. So while the mechanic of rebirth is present, the experience is completely different. This isn't a curse for them. It's part of the game. Still, the warp doesn't always play fair, even with its own. There are demons who get stuck, ones who are too powerful, too ambitious, or too unstable to reform properly. They fragment. They come back wrong. There are stories of demons who reemerge with half their memories, or new obsessions, or identities that have clearly been twisted. Think of them like files corrupted during a backup. They're still alive, still themselves, but altered, mutated. And that might be as close as demons come to suffering rebirth. There's also a darker theory, one that not many people talk about. Some fans think that certain demons don't come back as themselves at all, that their essence is recycled, not restored, broken down and reshaped into new entities, like spiritual compost. That means that death in real space might be the end of that particular you. Not that your essence is gone, but that it's no longer you at the wheel. 1,000 screaming shards, reforged into something fresh. Imagine being trapped in that, aware of what you used to be, but unable to reassemble yourself. That's not just rebirth, that's spiritual torture. And then there's the question of why demons keep coming back. Because they're tied to belief, to emotion, to worship. The more people fear them, hate them, pray to them, the more fuel they have. So in a way, demons don't choose rebirth. We give it to them. We feed it. That makes the whole system feel even more grotesque. They aren't just reborn. They're forced back into being by the emotional tides of a dying galaxy. That's not a cycle they control. That's a leash. So yes, demons absolutely represent a kind of rebirth. They are resurrected, reformed, and reinserted into the galaxy over and over. But it's not rebirth in the way a mortal might understand it. It's not growth or renewal. It's function. It's inevitability. They don't learn from death. They laugh at it. But underneath that mockery, I can't help but wonder, do any of them wish it would stop? Do they ever dream of peace? Or is that idea so alien to them that they wouldn't even recognize it? In the end, maybe the real horror is this. Even demons, with all their power and agency, might still be trapped in their own kind of coil. A rebirth they didn't choose, powered by forces they can't escape, destined to keep playing their role until the galaxy burns out or the warp itself implodes. And they'll laugh the whole way through, because that's all they've ever known. There's something uniquely tragic about Chaos Space Marines, not just because they turned on their brothers or because they abandoned their oaths, but because so many of them can't die. Not really. At first glance, that might sound like a blessing. Immortality, eternal strength, a never-ending war where you never fall. But look closer, and it becomes clear that what they've gained isn't life, it's imprisonment. It's a warped version of rebirth, a cycle of endless violence, mutation, and decay where the end never truly comes. Chaos Marines, especially those who've been twisted by the warp for thousands of years, aren't normal warriors anymore. They're echoes of themselves, remnants of the Great Heresy, dragged across 10 millennia of war. You have Traitor Astartes who fought the same battles in the same damn war for longer than entire civilizations have existed. Some don't even remember why they're fighting anymore. Their minds fracture, their memories loop, and their bodies, mutated beyond recognition, just keep going. Some fans call this the curse of the long war, and honestly, it's one of the most terrifying ideas in the setting. Because what happens when death loses meaning? When each time you're struck down, the warp pulls your essence back, patches it together, and spits you out into the next battlefield. It's not resurrection in the noble sense. It's more like spiritual duct tape holding together something that should have been allowed to rest. These aren't phoenixes rising from the ashes. They're revenants, shuffling forward under the weight of their own entropy. We know that the warp changes everything it touches. Time becomes fractured, identity splinters, and physical form turns malleable. For Chaos Marines who live inside that storm, on demon worlds in the Eye of Terror, this becomes their daily reality. Some of them have stopped aging in the traditional sense. Some regenerate from wounds that should have been fatal. And others die, only to return in some other campaign, years or centuries later, reforged by the whims of their patron god or the warp itself. And the worst part? Sometimes they remember dying. There's a story I've always found disturbing, about a chaos champion who kept waking up at the moment of his death, again and again. Every time he was slain, he'd see a vision of his execution, then snap back to life on a new battlefield. No rest, no rebirth. Just the same pattern. Violence, agony, awareness, and then it starts again. That's not immortality. That's spiritual entrapment. Like the warp refuses to let go of certain souls, especially those that amuse it. And what about the warp-forged war bands? The ones who've spent so long in the eye that they've become something else entirely. You look at the war bands of the Word Bearers or the Black Legion, and you realize some of them haven't just been around for 10,000 years. They've lived every moment of those years. They've changed bodies, forms, names, but the soul is the same. The pain is the same. And the war, still going. Fans have long debated whether Chaos Marines can ever find peace. Can a soul so corrupted ever be allowed to fade? Or does the warp just absorb it, reprocess it, and spit it out again in a new host, a new creature, a new horror? Maybe those who lose themselves entirely, who become spawn or demonic echoes, are the ones who finally break the cycle. But even then, who's to say that essence doesn't live on, somewhere deeper in the immaterium, trapped in a silent scream? And let's not forget the champions of chaos, the so-called favored. They're often promised elevation, demonhood, glory beyond death. But that reward is conditional. The gods are fickle, and for everyone elevated, dozens more are twisted into chaos spawn, their minds gone, their bodies broken. But they don't die. They endure, in pain, in confusion, in eternal mutation. It's a form of rebirth so cruel it barely qualifies as survival. Some theories suggest that even when these chaos spawn are slain, their essence doesn't dissolve. Instead, it loops. Maybe it's dragged back into a new body. Maybe it's layered into the psychic weight of a demon world. Or maybe, like a corrupted echo, it just plays on repeat in the warp, endlessly suffering the madness of its own existence. There's something profoundly sad about the Chaos Marines, especially the oldest ones. You can see it in the way they speak, those rare times they do. Bitterness, weariness, like they've outlived everything and everyone they ever knew, and all that's left is war. Some of them don't even want to win anymore. They just want to fight, not because they enjoy it, but because it's the only thing that still makes sense. That's the cost of rebirth through the warp. It's not a second chance. It's not renewal. It's a punishment disguised as power. You become a tool of forces that don't care about your soul, your identity, or your suffering. You get trapped in an infinite loop of violence, and they call it immortality. So when people ask if Chaos Marines can be caught in the Immortal Coil, I don't hesitate. Of course they can. In fact, many already are. Not because they sought it, but because they were chosen for it. And now, no matter how many times they fall, the warp won't let them rest. It just keeps bringing them back, broken, changed, and still fighting. There's a particular flavor of horror in Warhammer 40k that goes beyond the battlefield, beyond the blood and bolter shells. It's the quiet, cosmic dread of what happens to the powerful when they fall. Not when they die. No, when they're trapped. Caught in that strange limbo where they can't be killed, but can no longer act. Half real, half myth. That's where the concept of imprisonment in the warp starts to feel so disturbingly real. Because if gods and demigods can be caught in that state, what hope does anyone else have? The clearest example that fans always come back to is Lorgar's vision of the wolf in the warp. Not a literal beast, but a name whispered in forbidden places. A being trapped in a prison made of thought and pain, pacing back and forth behind psychic bars, endlessly gnawing at the edge of reality. Some believe this wolf is a shard of the Emperor. Others think it's a proto-deity born from mankind's collective wrath. But the one thing all interpretations agree on is that it's stuck. Not dead, not asleep, contained, and conscious. And that's the core of this idea. What does it mean to be imprisoned in the warp? We're not talking about a cage made of metal. We're talking about conceptual confinement. Your soul, your essence, your entire being, locked inside a realm that reflects emotion and thought. Imagine existing in a place that constantly amplifies your own torment, looping your failures and regrets like a broken machine. For beings of immense psychic or divine power, the warp doesn't just capture you. It plays you like an instrument. There are whispers that other godlike entities have suffered the same fate. Take the Satan, for example. While they're not warp-based beings, their story is one of ultimate power shattered and enslaved. The Necrons broke them into shards and imprisoned them inside technological tombs, turning gods into batteries. If that can happen in real space, just imagine what's possible in the immaterial chaos of the warp. Some fans theorize that similar fates await minor warp entities who cross the wrong patron, or even forgotten demons who outlive their usefulness. Even among the Chaos gods, betrayal and entrapment are not off the table. The lore tells us that the gods constantly war against one another, consume fragments of each other, rewrite their own narratives. It's not hard to imagine that in this metaphysical civil war, Pieces of one god could be trapped inside the domain of another. What if part of Khorne's rage is locked within Nurgle's garden, not destroyed but suppressed? What if Tzeentch has secret prisons, not made of stone, but of impossible logic and recursive thought, where entire beings are frozen mid-scheme, unable to escape their own paradox? We also have figures like Eldanesh, the ancient Eldar hero who was killed by Cain. But some say he still lingers in the psychic memory of his people, trapped not in the warp itself, but in their cultural soul, a spiritual fossil forced to relive his death again and again through myth and memory. That's another kind of prison, isn't it? When you're remembered only for how you fell, and your story never ends because no one lets it rest. And then there's the Emperor. Not in the traditional sense, but hear me out. He sits on the Golden Throne, body barely alive, mind fractured across the warp. Some argue he's a god in ascension, others say he's already part of the Immaterium. But either way, he's trapped, bound to his own empire, kept alive by daily sacrifices, unable to fully die or fully act. Is that not a prison of divine scale? Is he not reliving the Great Crusade, the betrayal of Horus, the fall of his sons, over and over in his fractured mind? A god bound by the will of those who worship him, who literally refuse to let him go. What's most chilling is the idea that the warp doesn't just allow these prisons to exist. It creates them. It thrives on them. Beings of power, souls steeped in emotional resonance, don't just fade away. They leave marks. And sometimes those marks deepen into scars so profound that the being itself can never escape. Not because they're physically restrained, but because the warp remembers. It becomes their tomb, their mirror, their echo chamber. Some fans think that this is the true fate of certain Primarchs or forgotten demigods. Not dead, not banished, just sealed. Folded into hidden corners of the Immaterium where time and space blur, where a scream can last 10,000 years and a thought can tear you apart. The lost Primarchs, the ones we never hear about. What if their punishment wasn't death or damnation, but silence? What if they were locked in loops of their own failure, buried in warp anomalies, where they still think they're fighting, still think they can win? It's the kind of horror that sticks with you, because immortality isn't always golden and triumphant. Sometimes it's rusted and decaying, suspended in a place where every moment stretches out forever, where you are both the prisoner and the prison. That's the thing about being divine, or close to it, in this universe. The higher you rise, the farther you fall. And when you fall into the warp, you don't hit the ground, you fall forever. Some of the most unsettling stories in the Imperium aren't about bloodshed or demonic possession. They're about silence, about the ships that vanish in the warp, never heard from again. The ones that simply disappear off the Auspex. No distress signal, no debris. Just gone. And if that were all, it might be chalked up to the usual dangers of warp travel. But then, some of them come back. And that's when things get truly terrifying. There's this infamous category of vessels among the Navy's Imperialis, ships reported lost centuries ago, even millennia, that suddenly re-emerge, drifting out of the warp in perfect condition, their hulls unscratched, their lights flickering as if they were just passing through. And when boarding crews enter, they find the impossible. Sometimes the crew is still alive, sometimes they're skeletons at the helm, and sometimes they're caught in frozen moments, mid-motion, as if time itself forgot to finish the scene. These ships become legends, ghost stories told by voidfarers, but they might just be evidence of something far worse. Time loops in the warp. A real, horrific kind of rebirth. The most disturbing accounts come from recovered logbooks. You'll hear of captains watching their own ships crumble from within, only to wake up hours later with everything intact. They swear they saw the ship fall apart, heard the screams, felt the heat. But now it's gone, and they're back where they started. And then it happens again. Sometimes the same crisis, sometimes different, always ending in catastrophe and always resetting. These aren't dreams. The crew remembers. Some start to lose grip on which moment is the real one. Others begin to question whether they ever left port in the first place. I remember reading about the Saint Selenica, a pilgrim vessel bound for Ophelia Severin. She went missing, presumed lost to a warp storm. But 400 years later, she reappeared in high orbit over the very system she was supposed to reach. No signs of damage. Vox systems still active. The passengers, thousands of faithful, were still aboard. But none of them had aged. Not one. The terrifying part? Every single one was dead. Peaceful, sitting in their seats, hands clasped in prayer. Autopsy reports claimed mass cardiac failure, like they all died at the same exact moment. And the ship's log? Blank, except for a single entry, written hundreds of times across every terminal. We never arrived. Some believe these loops are accidents, that the warp, in all its chaos, creates pockets where time collapses into itself. Vessels become trapped in temporal eddies, forced to relive a particular segment of their voyage endlessly. It's not just physical movement through space, it's metaphysical entanglement. You don't just lose direction, you lose sequence. You might be living the past, the future, or a version that never even happened. Others think it's not random at all, that certain souls or ships are targeted, maybe by the warp itself, maybe by entities within it. Perhaps some ships carry something, someone that the warp wants to keep, to torment. A navigator with latent psychic power, a rogue psyker hidden among the crew, or even just a particularly powerful emotional imprint from the passengers themselves. Fear, faith, despair. All of it could act like a magnet, binding the vessel to a moment in time so rich in psychic resonance that it just loops. Is that rebirth? It's not resurrection in the way we usually think of it. New body, new life, new path. But it is return. Forced, repetitive return. You die, and you come back. Not as someone else, but as yourself, just before the end. It's the same nightmare, played on repeat. And every time, you know what's coming. That might be worse than death. At least death is final. But to wake up again and again and again, knowing that the fire is coming, that the hull will crack, that the void will take you, what could be more cruel? The really dark theories go further. They suggest the crew doesn't even remember the first few times, that the warp lets them relive the experience over and over before the memories stick. Maybe the first 100 loops are pure illusion. Maybe the next 1,000 are lessons, and after that, maybe they break. Or maybe they start trying to change things, reroute the ship, pray harder, sacrifice passengers, and nothing works. That's where the stories get murky. We don't hear from the ones who figure it out. Maybe they vanish forever. Or maybe they get recycled, their essence fed back into the warp to start the cycle on another ship, with another crew. I've always found it fascinating that no Imperial doctrine officially recognizes these loops. It's always written off as psychic interference, or a warp anomaly, or even just superstition. But the black ships are told to watch for them. The Adeptus Mechanicus collect data on them, and the Inquisition classifies reports. That tells me it's real. Maybe not widespread, but real enough to be feared. So yes, these stories absolutely feel like a kind of rebirth, one stripped of all hope. They show that rebirth doesn't always come with enlightenment or growth. Sometimes it's just a cruel repetition, an endless rehearsal for a death you'll never escape. And if that's not the Immortal Coil in action, then I don't know what is. There's a kind of obsession in the Warhammer 40k universe that feels more dangerous than any demon or Xenos race. It's the human desire for meaning through suffering. The idea that death is not the end, but a test. That if you just die right, or die enough, or die for the right reason, you'll come back stronger, purified, elevated. That mindset runs deep in so many corners of the Imperium, and it's not just doctrine, it's personal, it's emotional, it's spiritual self-destruction disguised as salvation. You see this clearest in the ecclesiarchy, especially among the more extreme orders of the cult imperialis. They don't just worship the emperor, They emulate him. They believe that just as he gave his life to save mankind, so too must they suffer, die, and, hopefully, return. Some of the more radical sects talk openly about martyrdom as a gateway to spiritual rebirth. There's even a fringe belief whispered among the flagellants and flame-touched zealots that true death in service to the Emperor means becoming one with him. That your soul doesn't vanish, but is recycled, poured back into the galaxy to fight again, pray again, burn again. I remember reading about the Burning Eyes, a death cult on Seraphis Prime. They believed that by dying in sacred fire over and over, their souls would be cleansed of weakness and reborn stronger in the warp, not for chaos, but for the Emperor. They built elaborate chambers where the same select few would die, be revived through tech and faith, and then do it again. Dozens of times, hundreds, until their minds broke or their bodies gave in. But they believed. They wanted the coil. They called it the Emperor's Embrace. And that's where it gets really twisted, when people seek the very thing that horrifies us. Because if you believe that the warp holds the key to transformation, and not just damnation, then being caught in an eternal loop doesn't feel like punishment. It feels like process, like spiritual metallurgy, pain as purification, death as evolution, rebirth as reward. But of course, not all who fall into the coil do so willingly. Some stumble into it through trauma, corruption, or sheer bad luck. Look at the cults of Slaanesh. Their pursuit of sensation leads them into a cycle that feels eerily similar to what we've been talking about. The desire to feel everything eventually wraps around into oblivion. They chase death as an orgasmic high, and when it comes, they don't stop. They loop. Some get reborn as twisted demonettes or warp echoes. Others fragment, splinters of desire that continue to haunt their former lives. There are even cases where entire cults vanish into the warp during rituals and are seen years later, unchanged, performing the same rite as if no time has passed. Caught, preserved, repeating. And then there are individuals, people who were never meant to walk this path, but who end up devoured by it. Unsanctioned psychers, for instance, who tap into the warp without knowing what they're doing. They start having visions of their own death, then dreams of lives they've never lived. And then, eventually, they begin waking up in places they don't remember traveling to, with blood on their hands, whispering words in languages they never learned. You can't tell me that's not a form of recursive existence. Some believe the warp is grooming these individuals, testing different versions of them, wearing down their will until they break into something new. Fanatical Space Marine chapters have also flirted with this line. The Red Scorpions, the Black Templars. There are legends about warriors who've died in glory a dozen times and keep coming back, not just through apothecary resurrection or dreadnought shells, but through some deeper psychic recall. Not all of these stories are in official records, of course. They're told in quiet moments, around candles and incense, in chapels built for one. There's something poetic and deeply tragic in all of it. People who believe that the only way to escape suffering is to suffer more. That to transcend the mortal coil, you must throw yourself into the fire over and over until the flames no longer hurt. And maybe they're not wrong. Maybe the warp does respond to that kind of devotion. Maybe it gives them exactly what they're asking for. A cycle of endless death and rebirth, where pain becomes prayer and identity becomes ash. But what happens when they want out? What if, after the 100th death, the soul changes its mind? That's the horror. That's the trap. The Immortal Coil doesn't ask for consent. Once you're in, you don't get to choose the number of loops. You don't get to opt out. Faith might have opened the door, but the warp closes it behind you. These personal tragedies, these cults, zealots, seekers, and fools, are perhaps the most terrifying part of this whole concept, because they prove that the Immortal Coil isn't just something that happens. Sometimes it's something we create, something we invite, and by the time we realize what it truly is, it's already too late. There's a certain coldness when we talk about machines in Warhammer 40K, as if they're just tools, reliable, unfeeling, immune to the torments of the warp. But that's a lie we tell ourselves to stay sane. Because once you start looking into the dark places where machine meets warp, you realize just how wrong that assumption is. Machines can suffer. Not in the way flesh does, but in ways that are somehow worse, because they can remember forever. They can be trapped, not physically, but psychically. And the question that's haunted me for a long time is, what happens to them in the Immortal Coil? Can they be reborn? First, we have to talk about what the Imperium considers machines. In theory, anything with a processor and metal limbs is just that, a mechanism. But once you add in machine spirits, scrap code, and the rights of the Adeptus Mechanicus, things get murky fast. Because these machines feel. They might not have emotion in the human sense, but they have behavior, personality. Some ship cogitators refuse to operate unless properly appeased. Some dreadnoughts enter combat screaming in binary rage. Some STC fragments seem to remember ancient wars and react to them. And the warp notices that. It doesn't differentiate between flesh and silicon. If something has psychic resonance, no matter how faint, it can be seen. It can be touched. It can be twisted. There are reports, quiet ones hidden in the darkest vaults, of servitors and machine constructs being pulled into the warp during Geller field failures and coming back. Different. Not corrupted in the demonic sense, but aware, responding to voices, looping old commands over and over, not out of malfunction, but obsession. As if some echo of themselves got trapped in a moment and now replays it endlessly. Like a ghost, but made of code and bronze. One of the most disturbing examples I ever read was about an exploratory vessel sent by the Mechanicus to recover a lost data arc near the Hadrex anomaly. The ship had vanished into a minor warp rift for what felt like 5 minutes. When it returned, the onboard logic engines had rewritten their own programming. Every system behaved as if centuries had passed. Shipboard AIs had split into factions, developed cryptic rituals, and declared war on each other within the vessel's own networks. They had created a history for themselves, a mythology, all in the span of minutes. And when tech priests tried to reset the systems, the machine spirits screamed. Actual screams, recorded, repeated, begging to be left alone. Tell me that's not some form of technological rebirth, painful, involuntary, and terrifyingly intelligent. There's also the legend of the ghost pattern engines. No one knows who built them. Maybe Dark Age humans, maybe something older. These constructs, when activated, begin repeating a single series of actions, always the same. But no one can figure out what the actions mean. And worse, they react when you interrupt them. Not with violence, but with confusion. As if they were dreaming. As if they didn't know they were still running. The prevailing theory is that these machines experienced something so traumatic in the warp that they became stuck, trapped in a single behavioral loop. A rebirth without purpose. A mind caught between identities. Some fans have suggested that certain STCs, standard template constructs, might be alive in the warp. Not physically, but psychically. The sheer reverence and fear directed at them over millennia might have left enough emotional residue that fragments of their code gained presence in the Immaterium. There's even a fringe theory that one STC achieved true sentience, got lost in a warp breach, and now exists as a kind of machine demon, endlessly rewriting itself, trying to remember its original purpose. Can a construct want to be reborn? Can it suffer from not knowing what it was? The Adeptus Mechanicus doesn't like to talk about this. To them, machines are sacred, but predictable. The idea that a machine spirit might loop, or worse, evolve through warp influence, threatens the entire theological structure of the cult Mechanicus. They whisper about corrupted logic and cursed circuitry, but deep down, they fear something much worse: repetition. Machines trapped in existential loops, code caught in recursion, systems that don't crash, but live on, forever running simulations of themselves, searching for an end that will never come. And let's not forget the Men of Iron. the legendary artificial intelligences from the dark age of technology. Most were wiped out in the wars that followed, but what if some survived, not in the physical world, but in the warp? It sounds impossible, but if their neural matrices were advanced enough, if they had psychic bleed, they might have left ghosts. Not like human psychers, more like conceptual echoes, software that became soul. What if they've been reliving their fall for thousands of years? What if their punishment isn't destruction, but awareness without form? That's the thing. Once you accept that the warp is a place of emotion and memory, it stops caring what shape your vessel has. Flesh, metal, crystal, plasma, it doesn't matter. If you think, if you feel, if you remember, then the warp can hold you. And once it holds you, it can loop you. So yeah, machines can be caught in the Immortal Coil. Not in the same way humans or demons are, but maybe that's even worse. Because they can't rationalize it. They don't have myth or religion to soothe the pain. They just run the program, over and over. An error they can't debug. A process that never ends. A rebirth without growth. And if that's not horror, I don't know what is. There's something addictive about fan theories, especially the ones that deal with characters caught in loops. Once you start asking, what if they never actually died? Or what if they're still reliving something in the warp right now? It becomes a rabbit hole that's hard to climb out of. And when it comes to the Immortal Coil, the idea of someone endlessly dying and returning, trapped in the warp, there's no shortage of speculation. Some of it is wild, some poetic, and some unsettlingly plausible. Let's start with one of the most whispered names in this theory space, Alpharius, or Omegon, or both, because with the Alpha Legion, that line was always blurred. Officially, Alpharius was slain by Roboute Guilliman, but fans have long suspected that this death wasn't just faked. It might not have stuck at all. There's a theory that Alpharius, through some unknown pact or warp phenomenon, is caught in an eternal intelligence loop. That he keeps reliving his betrayal, keeps adjusting the Alpha Legion strategies from within a recursive pocket of time, subtly influencing real space events through echoes. Maybe he's not reborn physically, but conceptually. Each time, a new Alpharius rises, carrying fragments of the original's mind. An infinite legion, seeded with parts of a looping soul. Another name that always comes up is Conrad Kurza, the Night Haunter. His story already blurs the line between prophecy, madness, and predestination. He foresaw his own death. He wanted it. And when Mishen, the assassin, finally delivered the blow, it felt less like an ending and more like a ritual. Some fans think Kurzi never actually left the warp, that he became trapped within his own vision, forced to live through every nightmare he foresaw, again and again, unable to die because he believed he deserved to suffer. Maybe his body is gone, but his mind, his essence, is stuck, suspended in an eternal reenactment of his guilt. Some say the warp shaped a prison around his thoughts, locking him into a loop made of fear, punishment, and prophecy. Of course, we can't talk about this without mentioning the Lost Legions, the mysterious 2nd and 11th Primarchs, whose histories were erased so thoroughly that even statues of them were removed from Imperial records. Some believe this was more than censure, that perhaps these Primarchs didn't die, but were contained, trapped in a coil-like stasis where their lives, their betrayals, or their failures are repeated endlessly within a hidden warp vault. A punishment so complete that not even memory escaped. Think about it. In a galaxy where even the most horrific traitors like Angron or Fulgrim are remembered, how bad must the fate of the forgotten Primarchs be to warrant complete erasure? Maybe it wasn't silence. Maybe it was repetition. Then there's Janus, the first Supreme Grand Master of the Grey Knights. His death is vague, and his afterlife even more so. Some believe his soul was bound to the very structure of Titan, guiding the Grey Knights through the warp like a psychic beacon. But what if he's more than a guiding light? What if he's trapped in the warp itself, not quite dead, not quite alive, looping through a permanent vigil, reliving the birth of the Grey Knights, his defiance against the gods, his stand against demonic nightmares. Some fan interpretations portray Janus not as a martyr, but as a prisoner of duty, held in an unbreakable loop by the Emperor's will. And what about Cypher, the ever-wandering mystery of the Dark Angels? He carries the lion's sword, appears and disappears through warp phenomena, and always seems to be dancing around something bigger. Some fans think Cypher is trying to break a loop, one that began with the betrayal of Caliban. Maybe he's doomed to replay his mission over and over, trying to deliver the sword to the Emperor, failing every time and resetting. That would explain why he never finishes the task. Not because he doesn't want to, but because he can't. Because the coil resets him the moment he gets too close. There's also a growing theory surrounding certain sainted figures of the Imperium. Look at Celestine, the living saint. She dies, she rises, she burns, she smiles, every time. But what if her rebirth isn't a miracle? What if it's a loop? Some suggest that her soul is caught in a divine coil, repeating her martyrdom across centuries, reforged each time through pure warp faith. She doesn't remember the previous loops, or maybe she does and just keeps going, because that's what saints do. But behind the armor and the light, maybe she's tired. Maybe she's already died 100 times. Maybe she's starting to remember. Even some Inquisitors have been pulled into this mess. There's a theory about an unnamed Ordo Chronos agent who became so entangled with warp time phenomena that he exists simultaneously across multiple moments. Every time he tries to prevent a catastrophe, he finds himself back at the start, memories intact, body unchanged. He doesn't age, he doesn't sleep, he just loops, trying to save a galaxy that has already rejected salvation. Not because of chaos, but because time itself has turned against him. What all these theories have in common is this haunting idea. The coil doesn't just target the weak, it craves the strong, the iconic, the mythic. It draws them into loops not to torture them, but because they matter. Their stories echo so loudly that the warp can't let go. Or maybe it just enjoys the resonance, like a melody stuck on repeat, beautiful and tragic. So when we talk about the Immortal Coil, we're not just talking about broken ships or forgotten psychers. We're talking about heroes, monsters, saints, and maybe even gods. Characters who lived so fiercely, who burned so brightly, that the universe itself refuses to let them fade. And maybe, just maybe, they're still out there, trapped, remembering, waiting. So, after digging through all of it, every fragment of lore, every haunting whisper, every maddening theory, you can't help but ask, is the Immortal Coil real? Not just as a metaphor, not just as poetic language for a cruel fate, but as an actual phenomenon in the galaxy. And honestly, I think it might be. Not because there's one book that confirms it, or some codex footnote with the words spelled out in bold, but because the pieces fit. Too well, maybe. Like the universe is trying to tell us something without ever saying it out loud. Think about it. We've seen examples of it everywhere. Souls that don't pass on. Ships that return from nowhere, repeating their deaths in silence. Demons who never truly die, but come back changed. Chaos Marines who've been fighting the same war for 10,000 years without even knowing what victory would look like anymore. Eldar spirits trapped in stones, pressed into wraithbone coffins, forced to fight battles centuries after their death. Machines that remember too much. Saints who burn and rise again like it's just another part of the cycle. If that's not rebirth, what is it? But it's not the hopeful kind of rebirth. It's not reincarnation with purpose, or healing, or enlightenment. It's not karma or destiny. It's just repetition. The warp doesn't give you a clean slate. It gives you an echo. And sometimes that echo loops. Not because you did anything wrong. Not because you deserved it. Just because the warp can. Because your pain or fear or guilt made the right kind of ripple, and something latched onto it. That's what makes the Immortal Coil so terrifying to think about, because in the grimdark of Warhammer 40k, death was already supposed to be the only mercy left. And now, even that's uncertain. If a soul can be caught, looped, remade, replayed, then nothing is truly over. The past isn't buried, it's recycled. And the more powerful you were in life, the more likely the warp is to trap your echo and play it forever. Not out of cruelty necessarily, just out of resonance. And if this is what awaits souls, heroes, traitors, machines, saints, and monsters, then what does that say about the future of humanity in this universe? What does it say about the Emperor, about the Primarchs, about the dream of the Imperium itself? Maybe it was never about salvation. Maybe it's always been about containment, control, delay. One endless, suffocating cycle of suffering that no one can escape. But the thing is, this isn't just a story element anymore. It's something felt. Fans keep coming back to it. The theories aren't going away. The questions aren't fading. There's something in this idea that resonates deeper than a monster of the week or a lore twist. The Immortal Coil speaks to a fear that's very human, that the worst thing that could happen to you isn't dying. It's being unable to stop living. Living wrongly, repeatedly, without control. And maybe that's why this theory refuses to die. Because on some level, we all feel it. That in this universe, this vast, godless, howling galaxy of madness and steel, the soul has nowhere to run. You can hide it in a stone, you can bind it to a machine, you can pledge it to a god or offer it to the Emperor. But in the end, it all goes back to the warp, and the warp doesn't forget. It loops, it reflects, it feeds. So now I want to hear what you think. Do you believe the Immortal Coil exists? Are there souls still out there, caught in loops we'll never understand? Have we already seen them in the lore and just not realized it? Or is this all just metaphor? A dark fairy tale we tell ourselves to make sense of the warp's chaos? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Tell me your favorite theory or your own idea of who might be trapped in the coil right now. Maybe it's someone the Imperium wants us to forget. Maybe it's someone we've never truly understood. And if you enjoyed this dive into the strangest corners of Warhammer 40K's lore, make sure to like the video, subscribe for more, and hit that bell so you don't miss what's coming next. We're just getting started, because if there's one thing the Immortal Coil teaches us, it's that the story never truly ends. It just begins again.